Welcome to the Living a Nordic Life podcast, where we explore a simpler, cosier and more intentional life the Nordic way. I'm Fiona McKenna, your Nordic living guide and founder of Living a Nordic Life, where I share all things Nordic living and show you that a Nordic life is the way to bring intentional calm and healthy habits into your own life, wherever you are in the world. Are you looking for ways to bring simplicity, coziness and calm into your life? Well, let me show you how. Visit the Living a Nordic Life website to explore how I can help you on your journey to simple, healthy and happy calm, the Nordic way. You can subscribe to the podcast right here. And if you want regular inspirational emails sent with love from Norway and straight to your inbox, don't forget to subscribe to the Living a Nordic Life newsletters. And so now let's dive into our episode. Hello and welcome to this episode. And today I want to talk to you about conversations, Nordic conversations specifically. I had a chat recently to my friend Eric, who is from Nordic on Tap. It's a brilliant podcast that he makes on his own. It's fantastic, very detailed. You want to go and have a look at it. Google it, you'll find it. He talks about everything Nordic and a lot of quite deep and more of a deep dive into certain aspects of Nordic culture. And we talked about Jante's law, which is something that is very entrenched in Nordic culture, and how it was relevant even today in Nordic society. And if you've never heard of Jante's law, it's not really a law in the formal sense. It's more a set of unspoken rules that people in the Nordics have been following for hundreds of years. If you go look on my podcast list, actually, you will find an episode on Jante's law, or you can go to Eric's Nordic on Tap, and you will find an episode that is the two of us talking about Jante's law. But it's a set of unspoken rules that people in the Nordics have been following for hundreds of years. They govern the way we behave towards each other, how we see ourselves and society, and how we treat those around us. It's really, really deeply entrenched in society, and it plays an enormous part in how the Nordics sees itself and how others see it. But this made me think a bit more deeply about the ways in which Nordic people interact with one another, and in particular, the way we have conversations in the Nordics. It's such a subtle thing, and it's something that we might easily miss if we were not born and raised in the Nordic countries. Like me, I'm English, so I see things from a slightly different perspective. And I certainly think that unless you are really astute, you would miss it if you were simply on holiday here, and not here for a longer period of time. If you were here and you're working, even for a few months, and you're having these interactions with people on a daily basis in a kind of a normal way rather than a holiday sort of a way, then you would probably start to notice that things were just a little bit different. But you might of course notice the things that I'm going to talk about in your own family if you have Nordic parents or Nordic grandparents, or even further back perhaps. They might have been brought up with these habits and probably continue them now, regardless of where they live. Because if we learn these things as children, they're quite difficult to remove, aren't they? And if they're not harming us in any way, why would we? It's part of our culture. But maybe you see them and you think they're a little unusual and not particularly American or British. Where did they come from? Well, let me share a few things with you. Nordic conversations are very different to a conversation that we might have between two British people, or two Americans, or two Australians, for example. In America or England, we tend to get excited about what we have to say. We talk quite quickly, and often quite loudly, even in public, or maybe especially in public. Sometimes, because we're so enthusiastic, we might find that everyone within the conversation is talking at once. And when one person stops talking, the silence is immediately filled with more conversation from the other party. Because we're brought up to think that a silence in a conversation is wrong, and somehow it's uncomfortable. Why do we think that? It's not, is it really, if you start to analyse it? But in the Nordics, there's a structure to a conversation between people and a respect for one another's time speaking. Conversations are slower, they're more measured, and I find I have to stop, take a breath, and let my shoulders down just a little before starting a conversation with Norwegians, especially if I'm passionate about something. I find myself gabbling. I get faster and faster and faster. I do that sometimes when I'm talking here on my podcast. I get excited about something and it gets faster and faster. And I have to just slow down. But when I'm having that conversation with people in the Nordics and I'm doing that, I'm getting faster and faster and gabbling. I glance across at them and there's sometimes a slight look of shock or surprise and certainly amusement. So I have to make an effort to slow down. So let's break it down a little bit and look at the specific things that make Nordic conversations so different to conversations in other places. Not everywhere. I'm sure there are places where there are conversations that are very similar, but certainly, most of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, America. Everyone takes a turn to speak in a measured way. We don't all try to talk at once. And the other person will not interrupt the speaker until they are sure that they've finished what they're saying. That means waiting and watching them, looking at their facial expressions, having that kind of interaction. That sometimes we're not actively listening, are we? We're just thinking about the next thing that we want to say. Talking more quietly. Nordic people are more quietly spoken and they don't raise their voices in conversations unless there is an enormous need for it. There is a need for it sometimes, but generally speaking, no. And this is particularly true in public when conversations are at a normal level and not like everybody shouting across the school playground. You know what I mean? We just tone it down a little bit. If one person is speaking and stops for a moment, the other person doesn't interrupt. We wait until we are sure the other person has finished what they need to say before we start talking ourselves. I'm going to put my hand up here and say I find this really hard. And I often interrupt without thinking about it if there's something I want to add or include. I think, oh my goodness, I must say that now while we're talking about that particular thing within the conversation, because if we get to the end of that particular section of the conversation, I might have forgotten it or it might not be relevant anymore. But when that happens, the other person simply stops talking and respectfully lets the interrupter, usually me, carry on. I have to consciously try to stop doing it. And I'm getting better, but it goes against my upbringing and my culture. It's everything I've been brought up to think. It's okay, you can just, say that bit. And it's really hard. This waiting for the other person to stop talking also includes silences. Now, this is something you really have to learn. This is quite hard. The other person might take a moment to gather their thoughts, take a breath if they're talking a lot, but that doesn't mean it's your go. You wait quietly until you are completely sure that they've finished speaking, without feeling the need to fill that empty space with noise. You don't have to. You can just wait a minute. There's no rush. There's a straightforward and sometimes bluntness to Nordic conversations. They're straightforward, to the point, and often, if we're used to that kind of floweriness, a little bit blunt. It can feel a bit blunt. There's not so much in the way of fancying up conversations, and you're expected to be honest, straightforward, and to the point. It all reminds me of a book that I read when I was in my 20s. I was working as an event manager, and I had to do a lot of letter writing and talking to people, and often if there were appointments, they were very short, particularly if I was at an exhibition and I was seeing lots of different people. And I always felt the need, with letters especially, that I had to write a full page. I don't know why, because you really don't. But this book is called The Complete Plain Words, and I'm pretty sure it's quite an old book. But as a species, we've been having conversations for a long time, haven't we? So even if the book is 100 years old, it is still relevant. It's still in print, I might add. But it's all about making your point in conversations and in letters without feeling that you have to write a full page if what you need to say can be said in just one sentence. It conveys a respect for the other person's time. Why waste their time with floweriness and useless babble if you can say what needs to be said in just a few words? In the politest way possible, of course. We do not need to be rude, do we? But we don't need to waste a lot of time here if we don't need to. And that is the way that Nordic conversations go. They're straightforward, to the point. I'm making this point, you're making that point, that's it. There's no oversharing. It makes people uncomfortable. And I might have done this a few times, I have to confess. The first few times I did it, I'm not really sure that I noticed the reaction from whoever it was I was talking to, but I certainly do now. It's taken quite a few years, I have to admit. And it's subtle, and it can easily be missed. But if you overshare, even in the smallest way, with somebody who is not expecting that, so somebody who maybe you don't know very well, or somebody who is not a particular friend, then you'll notice that your conversation partner will look slightly uncomfortable and look away or look down. This is your hint to get back on track. Stop oversharing. Get back to the conversation. There are no huge hand movements or big gestures in Nordic conversations. And unlike some of our European neighbours, there is none of that. None of this gesturing and talking with your hands. People are much more restrained, and those big movements are not made. I guess it's back to that ideal of not wanting to impose too much on someone else's space, or drawing attention to yourself and them in unnecessary ways, because nobody else is doing it. If you start making big hand gestures, people are probably going to look at you if you're out in public. And then suddenly your conversation is not private anymore, is it? So how many of these do you do? How many of these do people in your family do? I think it's interesting to know whether they're inherited or at least passed on from our parents, grandparents, maybe even great-grandparents, because these family cultures carry on, don't they? And you might not even live in the Nordics anymore. Those people might not live in the Nordics. They might not have even visited the Nordics, but it's part of their culture that's been passed down. And I would love to know. Send me a message and tell me. It's really interesting. We'll do a little bit of informal research, shall we? And see just how many people have noticed this. Maybe you notice it within yourself. Certainly, now when you come to the Nordics or you have a conversation with somebody from the Nordics, you know a little bit about the way Nordic conversations are constructed. And I will see you in the next episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the Living a Nordic Life newsletters so you can get an email when I release a new episode. It's a quick and easy way to keep up with all things Nordic living. Please visit livinganordiclife.com. You can listen to Living a Nordic Life on lots of podcast apps, including Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts, and plenty of others. If you've enjoyed the Living a Nordic Life podcast, why not leave me a rating? So that's the end of Living a Nordic Life for today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.